probably a lot of the young people on the call have no idea what I'm holding in my hands. But these are projector slides. And this, I had actually, my wife had to dig them up out of her parents' basement where they had been stored for a long, long time because it contained some of the images that I was going to show you today. And so it really gave me a chance to go back decades and visit my own journey, which I have to say I have not done with respect to my research at all. And so it was very emotional preparing this because it really allowed me to have a look back into my own life, my own academic career, and truly learn a lot of lessons. And I think it's a bit of a mindfulness exercise. Had I not done that, I would have probably just continued on and really never had that perspective. So I hope what I'll share with you today is not really it's not a big scientific endeavor, but it's very much a personal journey. So I am at McGill University. This is the McGill University Health Center, which is a very large medical center here in Montreal. The yellow building here is the Children's Hospital. We also have the Shriners Hospital that Jerry mentioned, which is the blue building. And I sit in a very, very small office overlooking nothing because I have no windows in my office. So, but this is where I am, and it is a wonderful place to practice and see patients and perform research. Now, when I think back about my journey and why I got interested in research, I have to say it goes back to my dad. My dad was an orthopedic surgeon, but he practiced for most of his life until he moved to the US with my mom at a reasonably senior age in Egypt, Nigeria, and low-income settings. But my dad was very academically minded, even though he never wrote a single paper or did any research. He actually spent a good amount of his income subscribing to this journal. And I was just in my parents' home in Cairo last summer and digging through stuff, and there were a bunch of these journals still sitting that my dad was subscribed to. He was very interested in research. He always tried to see what is it he could bring to the bedside, even in a very, very limited, low resource setting. And I think in retrospect, probably his drive, his academic desires really ignited the spark in me. But my very first research experience really didn't occur. I mean, I went to University of Michigan for undergrad, and I did, I dabbled a bit in kind of some very superficial projects, but never really got engaged with a research team. And like most medical schools, McGill has a summer scholarship, summer bursary programs for students who want to do research. And I have to say, I didn't have a burning desire to do research, but I needed some income. I wanted to stay in Montreal for the summer. And so I joined Dr. Jerry Freed's lab. And Dr. Freed was a very young general surgeon at the time, really sort of doing cutting edge work. And joining him in the lab was really a fascinating experience for me because it showed me a bit of what I was to become in some ways, even though I didn't know it at the time. He was a busy surgeon. He was an excellent clinician. He was not, running a huge, grant-funded research efforts at the time, but he still had lots of research projects with residents and students, and he was, just as available in the lab as he was at the bedside. And of course, Dr. Freed, people in surgery know that he went on to become the president of SAGES and on the board of the American College of Surgeons, and really one of the most prominent minimally invasive surgeons in the world. So I was just very fortunate early on to join him at the Montreal Children's Hospital that you see here and be in his lab for the summer. But the following year, I went back again and took another bursary, and I did something very, very different because I really did not know what discipline I wanted to pursue. And so I actually worked with Dr. Negretti, who was a psychiatrist working with cocaine addicts. So that's as different from rats and guinea pigs with gallstones, which what I was working on the year before, as you can imagine. And it was a very different view on research because I was actually interviewing and testing addicts who were either in treatment or in recovery. And it really gave me a glimpse of how research can also be very human-centered and very patient-centered. And this actually became my first research paper, publishing it with Dr. Negretti as I was just starting residency and finishing medical school. But my very first peer-reviewed paper actually was not so much a research paper. It was more a review paper for the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And it was a bit of an ethics paper looking at patient restraints. And, I realized early on that, some people just sort of see the status quo and figure this is the way it's going to be. But I think partly because my parents were people who, always wanted to change things around them. I think I sort of imbibed that, and I did not like to just look at something and take it for granted. And when I was in medical school, restraining patients was what you did. Didn't have to be in a psychiatry ward if the patient was thought to be a danger to themselves, or too elderly, or maybe having some mental status issues. You just restrained them. And one day I saw a small child, 8-year-old child, restrained at the children's hospital, and I was really enraged at some of the practices. So I went and researched it, and I wrote this paper that won first prize. And I think ever since I've been questioning things, which is really, of course, extremely important. If you're going to do research, you have to want to question. And I don't think I've ever stopped questioning. Now, sometimes it has gotten me in loads of trouble, but it's always been worth it. Looking back at how I ended up being a pediatric surgeon, it's become clear to me since I started pursuing this field that it had a lot to do with my brother. I had one brother who was born, looked very healthy, and within a few weeks started to have heart problems and was found to have a lesion called tetralogy of Fallot, at least diagnosed clinically, because there were no echoes and no ultrasounds, no MRIs, none of that. So it's all a clinical diagnosis. But my brother just survived about 3-4 months and passed away. And it really, I lived, I grew up seeing the effect of that on my parents and what it's like to have a child who could have a curable surgical illness and not be able to provide that. So I really thought going into medicine that I wanted to do something with children, and then with surgery, and then pediatric surgery. But it really wasn't until August of 1990 when I did my very first elective. With my 4th year of medical school, my family had moved and settled in California, and I went back to Los Angeles to Children's Hospital to do a 1-month elective with Dr. Jim Atkinson. And Jim was very much a Jerry Freed in, pediatric mode. He was a busy surgeon. He was very patient-centered. He was loved by all the people in the hospital. He conducted research. He mentored. He was really an amazing person to work with. And after that month, I never looked back. From the first month of my 4th year on, I really never considered anything else, no other field and no other surgical specialty, and knew that that's what I wanted to be. So I finished medical school. My parents here came from California to attend my graduation, and I matched at Loma Linda University, again in Southern California, and went to start my residency there. And I met another mentor who I just mentioned, who really became very much a father figure to me, and that was Dr. Jerry Longerbeam, who'd been associated with the Giannini Foundation for a very long time. And Dr. Longerbeam, once again, was like a surgeon's surgeon, really a master surgeon, amazing in the operating room. When we talk about surgery, we talk about the bell curve. There's about 2 to 3% of people on the left who really should not operate. I mean, they always cause injury. They always cause problems. They're just not meant to do that. And then there's 2 to 3% of people on the right who truly have a God-given talent. It's like seeing, a beautiful pianist play in an orchestra, and they don't really have to work that hard just to be beautiful what they do. And the rest of us are in the bell curve, and we're safe, we're good, we just have to work hard at it. And Dr. Longerbeam was one of those gifted people. He really knew how to solve a problem, how to get a patient out of trouble, but he also was an incredibly spiritual man with a strong faith, and just a really true amazing human being. So he knew that I wanted to be a pediatric surgeon. And at the beginning of my 2nd year, he pulled me aside. He said, if you want to be a pediatric surgeon, you have to go to the lab, because it was nearly impossible at the time, and still very difficult today, to get a pediatric surgery position without doing something more than just your 5 years of general surgery training. You had to do research, or you had to do some extra studies somewhere. But really, at my time, there were only about 22 programs total in North America. And for those 22 programs, there would typically be at least 100 or more applicants. It was very competitive, and everybody had to show that they wanted to commit to research by being in the lab. So again, I admit, I didn't really have a burning desire, and I decided, okay, I have to go to the lab. That's what I have to to do to become a pediatric surgeon, so I'll do it. And that's where the Giannini Fellowship came in. Again, Dr. Longerbeam recommended. I went and interviewed. It was the first time I actually have anybody pay to fly me somewhere and to host me somewhere, which was really nice. I have to thank you for that. It was very generous, beautiful place in Monterey, I remember, and it was really like, wow, I've never been treated like this before. So it was very, very nice, and I was awarded the fellowship. And then, you know, where to do my research, it just made sense that I wanted to go back and work with Jim Atkinson at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I'd kept in touch with him. He's continued to be a mentor for me when I was at Loma Linda, and it was just a wonderful opportunity to work with him. So lesson number one is that these mentor-mentee relationships are really sacred. And, you know, when I think right now about how I try to mentor young people, I really often reflect on what my experience was like. And you know, there's no way that we can ever pay our mentors back. It's impossible. So the only way we can do that is really by paying it forward, by mentoring others. And certainly I've had the type of mentors that have been very, very hard to live up to. Now, what did I do with my Giannini Fellowship? Well, this is the project I submitted. It was a project on bowel transplants. And, you know, I knew nothing about bowel transplants, so I had to read a ton about it to be able to create my research grant application. And Jim Atkinson at the time, you know, everybody in pediatric surgery, a huge problem is short bowel syndrome. Patients who lose most or all of their intestine and have no intestinal capacity, and they have to be on parenteral nutrition for their life, you know, duration, and that caused a lot of problems. So a bowel transplant has always been really something to solve. And unfortunately, you know, it still has been the least successful transplant because the immunologic potential of bowel is immense, way more than a liver or a heart or a kidney. So it's always been a difficulty. And then it also has significant function with respect to nerve innervation and motility and so on. So there was this model that had been developed called the Thyrivella loop, where you transplanted a bowel loop and took it out of continuity. So you could take a bowel loop out of continuity and have an effluent and a drainage, and be able to study absorption by infusing certain fluids and so on. And you could compare a native bowel loop with a transplanted bowel loop. Now, that was sort of an exciting project at the time, but the things the people, you know, papers don't tell you is that to do this to an animal and to be able to run these experiments, you don't put the animal through any pain, but you have to restrain them for 5 to 6 hours at a time in a harness. And, you know, if you have a pet, you know that you cannot do that. No pet's going to allow you to be restrained no matter how much you try. And so I joined the lab, and within weeks, I realized that this is a really intensely frustrating experience. You know, we would run experiments every day, and maybe 1 out of 10 days we'd be able to collect the fluid we need. And this was really part of a big picture where, you know, things in the lab did not seem to be progressing much over a couple of years. I had a lab partner who had already been working on this project for 2 years and was really sort of at the, you know, he'd gotten to the very limit of his tolerance and was very discouraged. And of course, I was the one supposed to continue the work. So it was kind of hard to inherit that. And I'm really sorry to be crude, but I have to share with you this story because it's a true story that really kind of completely changed my approach. One, you know, he had tried everything to restrain these animals, and they would squeal and yell, and people would come from the other floors to see what we're doing. They were worried we're torturing the animals, and it was just always a very difficult scenario every single day. And he tried everything to calm these animals. And one day I went into the lab, you know, where we had our office and the lab was across. I went in, changed, and I went in. And my partner was just, you know, we were doing this on pigs, and he was touching the pig in some really unusual spots. And I say, what's going on? And he looked at me and said, well, I don't know. I thought some genital stimulation might help. So with that, I decided, okay, I think that's pretty much the end of my involvement in this project. And I came out of that lab that day and decided, okay, this is just not going to work out. So I actually was able to use the data to still complete what we could and write a paper, but I realized I'm not going to continue doing this. So lesson number 2 is it doesn't have to be such a, you know, a dramatic event, but you really need to know when to U-turn in research, because I can tell you, I see so many people who, and it's a thin line because persistence often also pays off. But at some point, I think you have to realize, okay, I need to do something different. So one of the things that I was very fascinated with was congenital diaphragmatic hernia. That's like an index condition in pediatric surgery where in utero, the diaphragm does not develop correctly. And so bowel herniates into the chest, and that causes severe lung hypoplasia, poor lung growth, and so on. And here you can see a picture of a hole in the diaphragm with all the intestines and the colon inside. And I had happened to have a patient like that when I was rotating in the neonatal ICU as a medical student. We spent 2 weeks there. It was one of the most impressive presentations because we didn't really have good prenatal diagnosis at the time. And I'd always remained interested in that. And with congenital diaphragmatic hernia, you get a perfect storm of respiratory failure because the abdominal viscera cause alveolar deficiency and severe pulmonary hyperplasia, which results in poor gas exchange. And then you also have severe pulmonary hypertension. Every fetus has normal physiologic pulmonary hypertension, but it's supposed to, the pulmonary vasculature is supposed to relax quickly within days, and the resistance in the pulmonary vasculature should drop. And that does not happen in diaphragmatic hernia. So you don't have enough alveoli, you don't have enough lung tissue oxygenating, but even the lung tissue that's available is not seeing all the blood because the blood is being shunted away from the lung. So it's really a perfect storm of respiratory failure. And one of the major advances that had occurred is that we realized this is not a surgical emergency, it's a physiologic emergency. So you cannot treat this by just simply operating on those patients. So this is where serendipity really comes in. I was ready to do my research in 1993, had decided on this bowel transplant project. But one thing I've always done since I was a medical student is subscribe to the New England Journal of Medicine, and I still do. I often share articles with my colleagues here and so on. Maybe I'm the only pediatric surgeon who does, I'm not sure. But it really kept me up to date on what's happening in the world of medicine. And the year I was joining Jim Atkinson, this really interesting article was published on inhaled nitric oxide for another big problem, ARDS. And at the same time, a molecule that we knew as EDRF in medical school, endothelial-derived relaxing factor, which was significant, which was very responsible for significant vasodilatation, was discovered as nitric oxide. And nitric oxide in the real world is welding gas. That's what nitric oxide is. That's what welders use to weld. And so right away, people started thinking, hey, can we put this into the lungs and cause the lungs to dilate without dilating the systemic vasculature? So I had read this stuff, and I thought, wow, this would be interesting, to see how it would work in diaphragmatic hernia, because there's a lot of pulmonary hypertension. So I went to Jim Atkins and I said, I really don't think I can continue in this bowel transplant project. I just don't see it going anywhere. I'd like to do this. I'd like to try nitric oxide. And there was a couple of publications coming out at the time by neonatologists, kind of anecdotal reports, but there really was nothing, zero in the surgical literature. And Jim was very open-minded, and that's really why he was an amazing mentor. He never just dismissed anything right off the bat. And he said, well, your Giannini Fellowship is not based on that. You'll probably end up losing it. And you would be starting this from complete scratch. Like, we have no model. We have no equipment. I mean, you're only here for 2 years. I was only in the lab for 2 years. I had to go back to my residency. And I said, it's okay. I think I can do it. Can you give me a chance? And he was very supportive. So we went ahead and we did really start from scratch. I would go to welding gas shops and buy these cylinders of welding gas. And we developed a pig model of pulmonary hypertension. We had to buy monitoring equipment. Again, these were for like warehouses. None of this was medical yet. And then I had to learn how to put, Swan-Ganz catheters in the pulmonary arteries of pigs, and the trial and error. So everything was really done from scratch. And that was intimidating, but it was also very exciting because there really was nobody else doing this. So any step you succeeded in, you became the expert pretty much right away. And I finally were able within a few months to develop what I call the swine intensive care unit. It's great because when you're talking to surgeons, you can tell them this is the SICU. If you're talking to pediatricians, you can tell them it's the PICU, porcine intensive care unit. And we really had all the components. We had the monitoring. We learned how to put A lines in patients. We learned how to put Swan-Ganz. We had a great hypoxic pulmonary hypertension model. We learned how to administer the nitric oxide and monitor it and so on. And it really became exciting to see this all come together from absolute scratch. And then, the first stumble in July 1994, my Giannini Fellowship was not renewed because the project, and I very understandably, the project I had applied for really, didn't continue, didn't bear fruit, and I was going to spend another year. But luckily, Jim came through and decided to fund me from internal Children's Hospital funds, and so I was able to continue my work. And we started getting some results, and the results were really, really exciting. Our model worked. Nobody else had used a hypoxic pulmonary hypertension model, but that was the closest to what we see in children. And so we actually found that not only does it work, but there seems to be a relationship to how severe the hypoxia is. So that if the hypoxia was moderate, you got very nice pulmonary vasodilatation, almost complete resolution of the pulmonary hypertension. And if the hypoxia was severe, there was some effect, but not as well. And we started to really kind of not just say that there's an effect, but to quantify the effect. And then one day we were doing an animal, and the nitric oxide tank ran out, and the animal just collapsed, just went into cardiac arrest. And we started the nitric oxide again, just reconnected to a different tank, and boom, the animal was back. And this was really amazing. And we decided to then, go ahead and try to observe it in several more. And we saw several more animals. And we described this phenomenon of what we call nitric oxide dependence, which means that you cannot just discontinue the gas all of a sudden. You actually have to wean it off. And this was the first time to actually see this phenomenon. We described it in our paper. And lo and behold, this became a significant human phenomenon that was described by Dr. Anthony Chang, who was a very young and super bright cardiologist at Children's Hospital at the time. And he described it after us in humans. And now every neonatologist knows that this is one of the consequences of using inhaled nitric oxide, that if you suddenly stop it, patients can go into acute heart failure, acute right heart failure, and cardiogenic shock. So we were discovering these phenomena that were really had such important clinical perspectives to them. And it was laboratory work, but it wasn't, I wasn't doing molecular biology and things like that. And at the same time that I was doing this, I could take it to the bedside, and we applied for an investigational new drug permit from the FDA, and we were granted that very quickly because there really was no other good treatment for these patients. So in the morning, I would be in the lab, getting the data on pigs, and in the evening, I'd be at the bedside with my welding gas tank at a baby's bedside, administering inhaled nitric oxide with a neonatologist at my side. And it was just a really, really exciting time to be in research. We presented our first results at the American Academy of Pediatrics in 1994. And, I was riding a massive wave, and people were walking up to me, wow, nitric oxide, that's really exciting that you're working on that. And I presented my paper, and the routine then was to have a discussant. And usually the discussant was, somebody chosen by the senior author, and would, come up and sort of say nice things about how amazing this paper is. And then, maybe like lob you some soft questions that you can answer. But in my case, the discussant was really kind of nasty to me. He came up to the podium, and you can see his commentary there, basically told me that, this model is not useful. There are so many confounders. And I have to say, like, the audience was really kind of stunned. And for the rest of the day, people were seeing me in the elevator and telling me, hey, keep your chin up. I think you did a good job, because it was just really, really painful. Anyway, I tried my best to answer the questions. And, I have to say, I took it in stride, and I still felt that we had something very significant. And I think that's the lesson I'd like to mention next is, be your own best judge. To the young people on the call, there will be times when you think you've done amazing, and somebody will really shoot you down. And if you really think you did amazing, don't let that discourage you. And the corollary is just as important. Sometimes people will really lift you up and tell you that, this is amazing what you're doing, but you haven't done your best. You can do better. And that should not get to our heads either. But I continued the journey, and our productivity really was quite amazing. We were able to publish some really important papers in high index journal, Archives of Surgery, Annals of Thoracic Surgery, and people wanted to hear from us. People wanted the data that we were producing because it was very quickly moving to the bedside. So I had a wonderful experience. In addition to the nitric oxide papers, I worked on multiple clinical projects, and I actually came out of my 2 years research fellowship with a very good bibliography. I still had to complete some of the papers during going back to residency, but the data was all gathered, and that was really exciting. So it was a really fun time. Jim would tell people, if you have a sick pig, Sherif is your man. But really, I was the surgery's expert on nitric oxide. I mean, nobody else was really using it in the surgery world, or doing research on it. Most of it was by neonatologists and internists and so on. And it was just really exciting. I would get calls from all over. And here I was, a third-year resident, but I would get calls from all over the world, literally, asking me, how would you do this? How did you monitor this? What if you get this? So it was really an exciting time. And so I entered the lab with the Giannini Fellowship, really just wanting to do my, kind of pay my dues, get my research done, apply to pediatric surgery. But I came out of the lab with a real desire to continue to do research, I have to say. And I think this is my next lesson, is that, you never know what will capture your imagination until you open your eyes. Many times you think this is just not for me, but until you try it, you might actually be shutting yourself out of some amazing opportunities. So nitric oxide was not a passing fad. It was here to stay. A couple of years after I finished my research, while I was still in residency, Dr. Ignaro, with two of his colleagues, Dr. Ignaro was at UCLA at the time, won the Nobel Prize for nitric oxide. And I have to say, I would read this back in residency, where I was working 120, 130 hours a week, and I was aching to go back to the lab, but it wasn't going to be possible because there was just no way that I could continue my research. This is my first day back on clinical rotations, and thankfully the nurses were really happy to have me back, but I really missed the lab. I missed having that expertise and being in touch with what's going on in the world. And so I was sort of trying to think, how am I going to get back into research? But it was really impossible to do it with 3 more years of residency. We did not have, the 80-hour work week. We did not have limited hours. You did not go home post-call. That was all, this is in the old days. So it was just brutal to finish the residency, and there was hardly a time to do anything else. So I completed my residency in 1998, and a year later, I happened to, pediatric surgery is a very small community. So the American and Canadian programs are all in the same match. So I happened to match at McGill, and I came back in 99 to, this is our old hospital that has now been torn down and converted into condos. And I met this guy here, Jean-Martin Laberge, who was my program director, the division chief at the time. And again, I just very, very blessed to continue uninterrupted mentorship, I would say, from one institution to the next. So I wasn't going to do basic research at fellowship. It was just as busy as residency. I was on call every other night for 2 years, etc. But we, as fellows, we're already board certified in general surgery. So we operate by ourselves sometimes. And I went in to do an appendectomy on a patient who had a very bad abscess contamination. We were still doing open appendectomies at the time. This is not the patient, but I closed the wound sort of like that with interrupted stitches, leaving a drain. And I thought this is a standard of care. I was doing what I've done, hundreds of times in residency. And then he came out and saw this. I said, why did you do that? I said, well, tons of pus in the belly. And he's like, no, look at our papers. And he showed me some of the papers they're writing, where they were really kind of challenging the surgical dictums and the status quo again on how to treat these patients. And I started looking at it, and I was like, wow, I really think I'm a bit behind on how we were taking care of these patients. So it's never too early to start looking at the literature with a critical eye. And I'm always giving this advice almost weekly to our trainees, is just do not take for granted what you read or what you see. Ask questions, be inquisitive, and be challenging. So anyway, the group here in Montreal had published this protocol, which I will not go into detail, but it really challenged a lot of the surgical dictums of the time. For example, they didn't culture pus, and everybody thought that's crazy. If you have pus, you have to culture it, see what's growing. But they felt that there was no use to do that, so they didn't do it. They didn't leave the drains that everybody was leaving. They closed wounds in a cosmetic way, et cetera, et cetera. And it was just a very different and progressive way of providing care, really supported by evidence. So I got interested in that, and I managed as a fellow to look at a couple of things. The first thing I did is look at the role of imaging, and then I looked at, I updated the Sentinel paper that had been published from the group here, and looked at our outcomes a decade later. And again, our outcomes were really among the best in the world at the time in terms of complications and so on, and hospital stay and all that. So it dawned on me as I was leaving my fellowship, and as a fellow, by the way, I got a degree and I got a wife, so that was really like an amazing deal. And we went back to California, Mary, my wife, and I, after finishing fellowship here in Montreal. And when I started practice in California at UCI, it was incredibly busy, much busier than my fellowship practice actually had been. And by far, the most common problem was appendicitis. And within literally, days, I realized this is going to be the most common way I can make a sick child better. I mean, all the other stuff we do research on in pediatric surgery, it's like a collection of rare diseases. So we may see it 4 or 5 times a year, but we're seeing appendicitis 400, 500 times a year, several orders of magnitude. So I thought, okay, I didn't really have the ability to run a lab at the time. And I actually took the job at UCI because it was the best job available. And I needed to be in Southern California. My parents had been getting older. I was an only child. I had been away for a long time. So I wanted to be back home. And really that was the best position available, but it did not come with any resources for research or anything like that. And it was an amazing place to be. I had an amazing time. My patients were really I miss them. I still keep in touch with many of them. I was part of a really fantastic department, but I was hired on, those of you who are familiar with the University of California, there's about 5 or 6 different professor tracks. And I was hired as a clinical professor. I did not have to write a single paper, do any research. My promotion was not tied to that. My salary was not tied to that. I didn't have to do any, but I was aching to work on some research. So I actually started doing some research. And this is my next lesson, is if people have limited expectations of you, that does not have to limit you. So don't let limited expectations limit you. And I started to get residents and medical students involved and carry on research and present research paper. And it was really the first time the pediatric surgical division there started to grow and become more academic. And again, that was very exciting. And really, the lessons I learned in how to enter a field like appendicitis, which is very, very common, thousands, tens of thousands of papers published, is start with focus proposal and look for areas that are not settled, areas of controversy. Look for unanswered questions and see how you can change practice. What practice are you willing to change? Just like Jean-Martin Laberge had really changed the practice of, how to care for patients after surgery in some of the work that he had done. So then I started to do a bunch of studies. We had a huge patient population. And the first thing I wanted to look at is, does the Montreal protocol work in California? Very different patient population, large number of uninsured patients, large number of patients presenting late, et cetera, et cetera. And it was just as effective. And then I started to look at, again, these were the areas of controversy. Should, appendicitis be treated as an emergency? Or can you put the child on antibiotics and treat them, in a more reasonable time the next day? So we looked at that, and we showed that in fact there is no benefit to treating it as an emergency. We looked to see, as in California, as you know, there's a lot of angst about who does what, and a lot of territoriality in clinical practice and so on. So we looked at, do general surgeons have as good or any worse outcomes than pediatric surgeons? And so on and so forth. So I will go a bit later, but a bit faster. But essentially, by the time I was ready to leave UCI 8 years later, I had actually published quite extensively and really made some lemonade out of lemons, because I was not required to do any research or have any research resources. In 2008, I was recruited to come back here to Montreal as a division chief. Never thought I would be back here for any reason, but it was a great opportunity, and really partly to take over from my mentor. That was a huge, huge incentive for me to come back. We had actually just bought a house in Huntington Beach when I was called to look at the job, and thought, okay, thank you, but it's not going to work. But a year later, we were back. And I had become interested in something else while I was in California that I really wanted to take to the lab. And that's the issue of gastroesophageal reflux. Huge numbers of operations done that really are not associated with particularly good outcome, and no good options to treat patients who have children who have gastroesophageal reflux disease. So I had in my mind an animal model that I had been working on paper. And when I came here, I finally had resources to access a lab, back with Dr. Fried's help and Jean-Martin's help and some department funds and so on. startup funds. So I actually went back to the lab for the first time since finishing my fellowship at Children's Hospital. And we would actually, I'll show you here a quick video. So we would actually created a model to inject copolymers at the GE junction. Here you see a copolymer being injected submucosally in a pig model of gastroesophageal reflux disease. And then we would actually simulate a patient with reflux who's been treated. And this time we did not have to restrain the pigs, thankfully. They just had to wear this harness with the pH monitor for 24 hours. And we really, again, it was laboratory work, but it was really more, I would say, clinical. We were working with animals, but these were clinical problems we were trying to solve. And we had amazing initial results. This idea actually seemed to work. We could inject this without any kind of poisonous effects on the animal. We were able to create a reflux model and show that this can improve it. But that was 3 years of really difficult time because I was trying to run a lab as I was chief of the division, huge clinical practice, administrative responsibilities, teaching responsibilities, etc. And I had to come to a very significant decision. Do I let go of a lot of that and really kind of continue to work in the lab, or is it more important for me to nurture my clinical side? And this is a difficult decision for a lot of people. It was very difficult. But for me, it was very clear that I always wanted to be around patients. I mean, that was really my passion. You could take away everything, but if you leave me the patients, I knew I was still going to be okay. So, when you're faced with tough choices, don't let people tell you, you got to do this or you got to do that, or that's going to be best for you. Just follow your passion. And my passion really was in clinical practice. So I decided to continue the work on appendicitis because there were still a lot of gaps, and we started looking at standardization of care. As an American coming to Canada, I was very interested in how the healthcare system is responsible for outcomes. So I compared outcomes across borders, still like a sentinel paper that was published in JAMA Surgery. We looked at, in a country where there is a universal healthcare system, what is it that then determines outcomes of patients? And, we asked multiple questions, and we worked with international groups and setting like something we could all agree on that we should look at for appendicitis. We did some really interesting patient-centered studies. Actually, this is just a trial that was just completed last month. And we really started doing, like just looking outside the box a bit. But two of the studies were really conducted by Fouad Youssef and then followed up by Yasmin Youssef. They're not related. Fouad was a Syrian refugee physician who came to Canada as a refugee. And we really tried to help him. And now he's just got a pediatric surgery job that we learned about 2 days ago, finished his fellowship. So an amazing success story. And he started working on things I had an idea, like I really wanted to look at appendicitis in a very different way, not just like simple or ruptured, but how can we quantify the disease? We were talking about 5 diseases in one, and we never knew how to compare outcomes between groups and so on. So Fouad started the work, Yasmin followed him, and really published studies that I'm still immensely proud of because it took several years. It was, prospective studies that took a while, but they really stood out in the literature as finally trying to clarify why we're seeing so much variation in this disease. And it was really exciting. The work on appendicitis involved 24 years, many fellows from many different countries. You see some of them listed here, and it was really wonderful to mentor students and residents and fellows through some of this work. And finally, this actually resulted in a new grade that we defined called, we're calling it the PAGE, or pediatric appendicitis grade. And we now put we submitted a Canadian Institute of Health Research, the equivalent to the NIH grant, for $1.6 million to validate this system across 5 different countries, and including all of Canada. We did not get the grant. We just found out the results, but we actually got reasonable scoring, and we're hoping to resubmit and get the grant. And I really feel that this would be the culmination of my work, and hopefully will change the care of these patients for good. Another really exciting research endeavor in the last few years has been CANCOR. CANCOR stands for the Canadian Consortium for Research in Pediatric Surgery. And this was an idea I had when I was in California, and I was trying to get Southern Californian centers together to form a research consortium. Never really able to put the time into it, but finally, after several years in Canada, I was able to get Canadian pediatric surgeons from throughout the country, essentially every major center. In Canada, pediatric surgery is all university-based, so there's really no community practice. And we formed this consortium. We just reported on the process of the formation of the consortium in the Journal of the American College of Surgeons. And this has been really a wonderful group that has now produced some important papers, has multiple studies going, and really reminds me of a great African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that's very pertinent to research. You know, going through this now for 30 years, I mean, I'm being a bit simplistic, but I find there's sort of two categories of people. The person who thinks that, you know, if they compliment somebody else or somebody else gets credit, it's a zero-sum game and that's going to be less for me. And the person who feels that the sum is greater than the parts. And I just, you know, and we all have this, you know, seduction to kind of put ourselves above the others. I mean, I don't discount myself from that. We all have this desire to sort of be first and be recognized. And that sometimes is difficult when you feel like you put the energy in and you're not. But I think overall, it really is so much more satisfying to see people succeeding together. And this is what CanCor has been about, and very exciting organization that I'm now, after 5 years as the inaugural chair, ready to pass on to somebody else. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is not specifically research, but a lot of research was integrated into this project, is this journey with slides that you see here. I started taking pictures of clinical patients, materials, and x-rays, pathology when I was a resident. And again, I have a whole binder of that my wife just discovered of diseases and patients that were collected since the early 90s when I started my residency. And then, of course, the digital camera came and that took over. But by the time I had completed residency, my fellowship in 2013, I had a library of more than 30,000 photos. And they included everything from presenting signs that you see on patients, surgical findings, radiology illustrations, etc. And I had this real urge to do something with them. And I had always been thinking of writing a book, but there's a lot of really good pediatric surgery books. So the idea I got is to write a book about the practice of surgery, not the science of surgery. And of course, practice comes from science. But what I meant was what I call the art of good judgment and wise decision making. That's very difficult to capture in any of the textbooks. And so Taylor and Francis, one of the major publishers, asked me to put a proposal. I did, and it was accepted. And in September 2019, I published my textbook, which has really been my life's, desire to see this come. And it was a very exciting. When I signed the contract with Taylor and Francis, I didn't know that my dad would be diagnosed with a lethal disease in California and pass away a year later. I didn't know that I would continue to work overseas. I didn't know that we'd have miraculously our young daughter. And, you know, there were so many adversities, most of which that my partner who signed the contract with me withdrew from writing the book 2 years later. And I was left to really do the other half or just renege on the whole thing. So it was a really a moment of real triumph. And I'm still very excited about this book. But what I wanted to do with it is to diffuse it, to get it into people's hands who would normally not buy it. So we did this in two ways, and this is more like the science of education, if you will, by taking it to the internet, to Twitter and to LinkedIn, and creating case scenarios that anybody can participate in. There's one on Twitter, if you just look on Twitter today, or on LinkedIn or on Facebook, and people will interact with these case scenarios, and then we present these commentaries, and people can learn some really important clinical facts in just a couple of minutes. My fellows have participated, our senior fellows doing the next commentary. Surgeons from low and middle income countries have participated, surgeons from other American centers. And it's been a wonderful way to democratize learning and bring this concept of case-based learning really around the world. And then Dr. Levitt, a really good friend and colleague in DC, joined me, and we took my book and his colorectal books and started a program to diffuse it to surgeons who cannot buy the book because of its price in North America, which is not huge, but for many surgeons in many of the countries that are low income, it would be, you know, a month or two salary. So we created a program to diffuse the books, and, you know, it was a specific application process, but we ended up sending our books to 80 countries in 280 institutions, more than 3,000 surgeons and trainees. And more important than just sending the books, it created an amazing community of pediatric surgeons and trainees who now, will email me and Mark about problems, about just advice even on careers and so on. And it's just been wonderful to create that community. So the last lesson is that you never know the size of the tree that will grow from the seed that you plant. Nothing is ever too small. So I now kind of turn it over to you and, ask you to reflect a bit. When I look at my research spectrum, I find that I've published on many different areas. The three in bold are really what were ended up being my areas of focus. But I was involved in a lot of things, and people would sometimes ask me, what area of research do you work on? And I would say, well, I muck around in everything. And in some sense, it was true. And I enjoyed that, but I have to say, I don't know if that would be the advice I would give somebody. I do think there is a real benefit on focusing on one or two areas, like I was doing on nitric oxide when I was a resident, and really building that expertise. So I think it's a personal decision. And the next difficult one for clinicians, especially for surgeons, I would say, because, as a surgeon, the amount of surgery you do is directly linked to your technical abilities. Like, you cannot operate once every 6 months and be able to, continue on. So how much do you need to do to really continue to be a clinical surgeon versus run a lab? And this is, I know, a dilemma that a lot of young people have right now who are interested in surgery, but also want to run a lab. How do I do it? Especially in something like pediatric surgery, where it's already a lot of rare things that you might see a couple of times a year. And if you're only doing 50% practice, that means you might see them a couple of times every 2 years. So that's a difficult question. And I, again, kind of like reflecting back, how am I finishing my research career now as my last few years of practice and research? Pretty much how I started. I'm not really interested in like just publishing for the sake of publishing. I'm interested in asking questions that I think will change practice. And I look at the papers of the last few years, they really were all targeted at significant areas of controversy where we believe our publication can have a significant effect on practice change. So summarizing all this, one of the singular honors I had is to be able to speak to the graduating class, give the commencement address at UCI in 2010. And this is what I told the students about research: always be inquisitive. Research is the tool by which medicine continues to advance. Some of you will progress to become established and dedicated researchers, but research is a spectrum with plenty of room for different degrees of involvement and commitment. You can choose how much you want to do. Even the occasional case report adds something to the body of knowledge. Keep an open mind and ask the difficult questions. If you have an idea, pursue it. Embrace innovation that truly benefits the patient. Evidence-based medicine is the call of the day. Seek the evidence, use the evidence, create the evidence. That's really my advice to anybody today. It is an absolute pleasure to be part of a team where there's a lot of inquisitiveness, a lot of young people, both residents and fellows and young attending surgeons who are really interested in building research careers. And now I can kind of play Jim Atkinson or Jerry Longerbeam or Jerry Fried or Jean-Martin Laberge. And I just wanted to dedicate this talk to Dr. Longerbeam. It was actually quite emotional for me seeing my picture operating with him. It was one of those slides that had to be scanned to put on here. And I would just tell him that you taught me not by your words, but by your deeds. He was really an amazing human being, and I miss him very much. So I will end here. Thank you all very much again for inviting me.